So, Aventurine Waveflair, what a character. It's no secret at this point that Aventurine's kit is in a very unfortunate place. His damage is just very underwhelming, and he's not offering enough to earn his spot on his follow-up attack team variants or his Elation team variants. He's in a very weird spot where his teams are strong enough to clear endgame content, but it's not because Aventurine himself is necessarily doing anything for those teams. And there are pretty much always better options that you would rather use over Aventurine, and in some cases, those options are significantly better. However, it's also clear that Aventurine's kit is currently so bad that it is definitely going to get buffed. The only question remaining is, how will they buff Aventurine in a way to make him earn a spot on any team? What can they do to this underwhelming, confused kit to finally make him competitive with other characters? I have done hours upon hours of testing with Aventurine in different teams, so let's go through my thoughts on what I would like to see change about Aventurine and how I expect Hoyo to buff him. Before we begin, if you don't know what Aventurine's kit does, watch this video of mine for a simple summary. If you haven't heard about how poorly Aventurine is currently performing compared to other characters, then watch this other video of mine where I discuss the results of my testing and compare Aventurine to other characters. With all that out of the way, let's get into my proposed changes for Aventurine. There are several different directions Hoyo could take with Aventurine's changes, so I'm going to split his possible buffs into 3 different categories: Elation Aventurine, Follow-Up Aventurine, and Hypercarry Aventurine. We'll define each of these categories more in depth as we touch upon each of them, but let's start with the easiest one to talk about first, Elation Aventurine, or more specifically, Aventurine in a mono Elation team. This one is the most straightforward, simply because Aventurine's kit doesn't offer anything unique for Elation teams. Most of his damage is Elation damage, which allows him to benefit from Elation buffs from Yao Guang, and most of his damage comes from his Elation skill, which Yao Guang also helps with. But aside from just dealing a lot of Elation damage, there isn't any other particular synergy there. He's clearly meant to be played as the main DPS, so it's not like he's offering much to Silverwolf or Evanescea as a sub DPS compared to Sparksy, who at least does buff the team and has outstanding punchline generation, and he's obviously not an Elation support either. All Aventurine offers to Elation teams is personal damage, and so if they want to push him into Elation teams even further, they would probably just buff his numbers to make him more competitive with Silverwolf and Evanescea as a main DPS. This is why I personally don't think they'll push him into Elation teams, simply because none of the interesting parts of his kit interact with Elation teams whatsoever, and neither do his current Eidolons, which I guess they could change if they wanted to. Aventurine's ability to speed up Aha whenever allies attack can only happen when he's solo Elation, and it is arguably the most interesting aspect of his kit. They could remove the restriction on this and allow him to speed up Aha with other Elation teammates present as well, but this would actually probably end up being really bad for Silverwolf and Evanescea by forcing Aha to happen too frequently without being able to build up enough punchline first for Silverwolf's MMR or Evanescea's energy. Aventurine himself is already suffering from speeding up Aha too much and causing his own Elation skill damage to be underwhelming with not enough punchline. Because of this, I don't see much they could do with his current base kit to make it more interesting for Elation teams outside of just completely reworking him. The interesting mechanics in his kit just inherently make more sense in his follow-up attack teams, so I don't have much else to say about his Elation teams aside from maybe they'll buff his damage. I will say that I personally would love it if Aventurine was really strong in mono Elation teams, simply because I love Aventurine and I want him to have the strongest team possible. And my intuition is telling me that Pearl and Nihilux are likely going to be very strong Elation supports, so I would love for them to be on Aventurine's team, but I just don't see Hoyo taking him in this direction. His Elation playstyle definitely just seems to be an afterthought to Hoyo. That brings us to Aventurine's main playstyle, his follow-up attack team. And there is a lot that needs to change about Aventurine in order to make him worthy of a slot on a follow-up attack team. But first off, what defines a follow-up attack team? There are plenty of different follow-up attack units that you can place on a team to enable a frequently attacking playstyle. So we are going to define Aventurine's follow-up attack team as requiring every character on the team to offer frequent attacks and decent personal damage. Obviously, the premier follow-up attack team in the current meta that fits this description is the Ashvale and Morton AshBlade pairing, aka the AshBlade team. This is the team that most people have their eyes set on. For characters like Tribby or Robin Summeretto, who also attack frequently but are more focused on buffing rather than personal damage, we will cover them more in the Hypercarry Aventurine section afterwards. So, for the AshBlade follow-up attack team, Aventurine has quite a few issues. From my previous video, I established that he was barely even better than Gilgamesh in this team, who is a free unit, and the further you vertically invest into Morton AshBlade, such as getting his powerful E2, Aventurine just straight up starts losing to an E0 S1 Acheron and Fei Xiao in this team in a lot of scenarios, which is sort of crazy that he's even capable of performing worse than characters that released 2 years ago at equal investment. But why is this the case? What is it about Aventurine's kit that is making him underperform to such a degree? First off, if we look at AshBlade's best in slot teammate options, we have Tribby and Robin Summeretto. What do these two characters have in common that Aventurine doesn't? Obviously, it's their team-wide buffs. Massive buffs at that. Compare that to Aventurine offering literally zero buffs to AshBlade whatsoever, and the result is that the massive drop-off in Ashvale and Blade's damage is just not worth slotting in Aventurine over a character that can buff them by such a substantial amount. Now, theoretically, if Aventurine's own damage was so high that it could offset his lack of buffs, it would be fine for him to offer no buffs. But at that point, if AshBlade's own damage really doesn't matter that much for the team, you could very easily end up in a scenario where you'd rather play Aventurine with supports that focus solely on buffing his own damage, like Robin Summeretto. AshBlade obviously offer their own significant buffs, of course, but my point is that buffing Aventurine solely by increasing his damage numbers would run the risk of pushing him into the hyper carry Aventurine playstyle rather than the AshBlade follow-up attack team, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just not what we're talking about in this section of the video. So, under the assumption that we want Aventurine to function better with the AshBlade duo specifically, he does need to offer more to the team, which is his first issue. In addition to Aventurine nerfing AshBlade's damage, Aventurine's kit itself is clunky because he's unable to stack enough punchline or fervor to maximize his own damage. Aventurine's kit works in a way where the more stacks of punchline and fervor he has, the stronger the Aha instant will be. But due to a combination of Aha being too fast relative to Aventurine's punchline and fervor stacking being too slow, his kit is just contradicting itself in its inability to actually get his damage out. So we'll talk about how I would fix this as well, because as it currently is, he's nerfing AshBlade's damage just for his own damage to also be clunky to utilize. Lastly, his Eidolons are just very underwhelming, so I'll touch on what I would like to see them change for his vertical investments. Before I even talk about how I would address these issues though, I want to address one sentiment I see people floating around. There are a lot of people saying, oh, Aventurine can't be too powerful in the AshBlade team because the AshBlade team is already so powerful that giving them a significant upgrade would break the game. Therefore, Aventurine needs to stay mid. And to that, my response would be, do these people know that AshBlade is already going to get a powerful upgrade next patch in the form of Robin Summeretto? If Robin wasn't about to be a massive upscale for AshBlade, then sure, I think you could argue Aventurine doesn't need to be super powerful since the team is already strong. But it makes no sense to keep Aventurine weak in the AshBlade team when the AshBlade team is getting a buff next patch with or without Aventurine due to the existence of Robin. Therefore, it actually is sort of mandatory that Aventurine gets buffed so he can perform at least on par with Robin in the AshBlade team, since that would arguably be the only team in the game Aventurine is even able to be strong in, whereas Robin is still a best in slot support for 10 other teams while still being an upscale for the AshBlade team, which is quote unquote supposedly too strong to get an upscale. So no, it is not a valid argument to say that the AshBlade team is so strong that it justifies Aventurine's current power level. If that were the case, nothing would justify Robin's current power level, since she is an even bigger upscale for the AshBlade team at the current moment. With that out of the way, how can we address the first issue of Aventurine not offering enough to the team? We could just slap a bunch of team-wide buffs onto his kit and make him a pseudo-harmony unit, but I actually don't think Hoyo would do this, nor do I think they should. That just isn't the identity or design direction for Aventurine's kit. He isn't meant to offer huge buffs to the team. Instead, there's another way for Aventurine to still support AshBlade that doesn't require Hoyo to change the design of his kit at all. In fact, you could argue it would fit the design of his kit even more. The whole reason Hoyo held back so much with Aventurine's V1 kit is most likely due to the existence of infinite loops. If you don't know what an infinite loop is, watch this video of mine, but essentially, characters that attack too frequently, like Mortonak's Blade and Tribby, run the risk of feeding into each other's charging mechanics and energy in a way that allows them to infinitely chain their attacks back to back without end, never allowing enemies to take a turn. Mortonak's Blade was a huge balance nightmare for Hoyo due to this, and the fact that Aventurine was designed with the intention of synergizing with Mortonak's Blade likely made them scared of breaking their game even further, thus why Aventurine was released in its current state. But there is a very easy way for characters to still synergize with frequent attacks without the risk of infinite loops. An easy way for characters to essentially contribute their own damage every time an ally attacks without overcharging characters like Mortonak's Blade. It's so simple and synergistic, in fact, that it is the original mechanic that Hoyo used to give to follow-up attack supports like the original Robin, and they even gave the mechanic to Tribby, the easiest way possible to benefit from your allies launching frequent attacks. That's right, additional damage. Such a simple mechanic, and yet it has always been the perfect way to synergize with frequent attacks without risking infinite loops. By dealing additional damage every time your allies attack, the additional damage is also happening very frequently, but since additional damage procs don't actually count as their own instance of an attack, it doesn't give any charge or energy to characters like Tribby or Blade, thus easily stopping the possibility of infinite loops happening while still essentially dealing damage super frequently. This is what Robin's kit was all about back in the Penacony days, and it is shocking to me that Hoyo isn't leaning into it more for their current AshBlade follow-up attack team. If Aventurine is meant to primarily fit in this team by offering his own damage, but Hoyo is afraid of the possibility of infinite loops occurring if they give him too many frequent attacks, just make a large portion of his damage in synergy with AshBlade come in the form of additional damage that occurs on AshBlade's attacks. In fact, Aventurine already has something like this in his kit, sort of. In the last sentence of Aventurine's talent, it states that when he has Certified Banger, his skill and ultimate additionally deal elation damage. Obviously, this only applies to his own skill and ultimate, but Yao Guang also already has a version of this in her kit, dealing additional elation damage when allies attack. If they just take this aspect from Yao Guang's kit and multiply it tenfold in Aventurine's kit, it would solve a lot of the issues with Aventurine. They should change Aventurine's talent so that, while he has Certified Banger, he now deals additional procs of elation damage whenever any ally attacks, instead of only being for his own skill and ultimate. Make it similar to Yao Guang's, except with massively higher multipliers, so that the damage of those additional damage procs are a significant portion of Aventurine's damage, as opposed to Yao Guang's additional damage procs, which aren't that noticeable most of the time. You could even nerf the damage multipliers of his elation skill and make his damage lean even harder into these additional damage procs. In this way, he's not actually buffing Ashvale and Blade's personal damage much, but it's still going to feel so much better because so much of Aventurine's damage will be happening on AshBlade's attacks. And if the multipliers are high enough, it'll accomplish a similar thing without making Aventurine lean so hard into a hypercarry playstyle, since his damage is relying on AshBlade's attack frequency, and it also isn't changing his design direction into making him a team-wide buffer like Tribby, since his main contribution is technically still from his own personal damage. And you want to know the best part about changing Aventurine's kit to function as an additional damage DPS who deals most of his damage during his allies' attacks? It would be so thematically fitting for the Elation path. Allow me to bring you on a trip down memory lane, back to when Honkai Star Rail first released. Back in my day, before we had Divergent Universe, we had the Simulated Universe. Everything worked differently in the Simulated Universe, including the Elation path buffs. Back then, the Elation path was a path focused on follow-up attacks, and more specifically, it focused around a completely unique mechanic known as Aftertaste. Some of you probably just got nostalgia hearing that word. Aftertaste functioned very similarly to additional damage, triggering Aftertaste damage whenever allies launched follow-up attacks. The fact that the concepts of additional damage, follow-up attacks, and the path of elation were all inherently connected to each other when the game first started would just make it such a full circle moment with Aventurine's kit if he was an elation main DPS whose whole gimmick was synergizing with follow-up attack units via providing additional damage procs similar to the Aftertaste mechanic. But in his case, it's elation damage since he's an elation character. It would all just fit so perfectly, while at the same time being the perfect solution to the balancing nightmare of infinite loops, since again, additional damage inherently avoids that issue. It's so perfect, in fact, that it's mind-boggling to me that Hoyo didn't see this low-hanging fruit in front of them and instantly go for it. Elation path, follow-up attacks, and additional damage. These things conceptually go hand in hand. More than anything, this is what I would want them to add to Aventurine's kit. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how likely this change is, since it would require a pretty big mechanical change to his kit, and Hoyo doesn't often do changes to this degree, but in my opinion, this is what his kit should have been focused on to begin with. So that's one way for Aventurine to offer more to the team. But how about the rest of his issues? First off, Aventurine's punchline generation is one of the big things holding his damage back, and buffing his punchline is a much more interesting way to increase his damage, as opposed to just buffing up his damage numbers. Change his talent so that when he's solo elation, ally attacks give him 2 punchline instead of only 1 punchline, essentially doubling the punchline he's getting from allies. This will help his damage a decent amount. I also think that if we were to give Aventurine any team-wide buffs, the most interesting and unique way to go about it would be for Aventurine to allow other allies to make use of punchline and certified banger for their own damage. Make Aventurine allow non-elation characters on his team to also get stacks of certified banger after every AHA instant, and those allies gain defense ignore based on the amount of certified banger they have. This way, as long as you're reaching a consistent 30 punchline on every AHA instant to convert it into 30 certified banger, AshBlade would essentially have a permanent 30 defense ignore from Aventurine, which perfectly brings them to 100% defense ignore between their own combined buffs. You could even make it so that Aventurine himself doesn't get this certified banger into defense ignore conversion, so that he still needs to run the Magical Girl relic set to get closer to 100% defense ignore. The whole team would be benefiting each other so much more, with AshBlade's frequent attacks giving more punchline, and with that punchline making Aventurine's elation skill stronger, while the AHA instant is also benefiting AshBlade directly, now that they can actually hold certified banger, despite not being elation characters, to convert the certified banger stacks into defense ignore. It technically doesn't have to be defense ignore, it could easily be any other type of damage buff conversion that AshBlade can make use of, but defense ignore just makes the most sense to me, given how perfect it would be to bring AshBlade from 70% defense ignore to 100%, and 30 punchline for every AHA instant is a really fitting number for the amount of punchline this team can consistently generate between every AHA turn, assuming they also double the amount of punchline Aventurine is gaining from his talent, so it all just fits together perfectly. Speaking of doubling Aventurine's stacking mechanics, his fervor stack generation is the next thing I would want to see buffed. Oftentimes, Aventurine only manages to stack his fervor half halfway before Aha takes a turn and consumes all of it, meaning he is hardly ever able to dish out his maximum potential damage. Let follow-up attacks give him double the amount of fervor stacks, further pushing his synergy with follow-up attack teammates, and that'll fix another one of the clunky things about Aventurine's kit. The last thing in Aventurine's base kit I would really want to see buffed is his speed to elation conversion trace. I don't have a problem with this inherently, but for some reason, this trace is a copy-pasted version of Silverwolf 999's exact same trace, except Silverwolf's numbers are just bigger. In fact, Silverwolf 999's trace is basically exactly Aventurine's, except all the numbers are doubled. So just double the amount of elation stat Aventurine is getting from his speed conversion, so it can at least match Silverwolf, and it'll make much more sense. As for Aventurine's Eidolons, a decent amount of the issues with his Eidolons would be addressed with the base kit changes I suggested. First off, I would want his E1 put into his base kit, not the res pen, but let him launch his elation skill every time he gains 10 fervor stacks, increasing his attack frequency in his base kit. Aventurine already avoids the risk of infinite loops with his attack frequency because he stops being able to launch these elation skills whenever his fervor stacks max out, meaning it is impossible for him to launch them infinitely. So just put the attack frequency from his E1 into his base kit so his base kit feels a lot better. And then there's another issue that I know many in the community have been vocal about: the fact that none of Aventurine's attacks count as follow-up attacks. This isn't actually that big of an issue, since the only buff he's realistically missing out on is 80% crit damage from Ashfail, which is still relevant and it would be nice to have, but making Aventurine's attacks count as follow-up attacks wouldn't magically allow him to benefit from the 75% damage bonus of Blade's powerful E2, which is what a lot of people are concerned about right now, since so many of the characters Aventurine is competing with make much better use of Blade's E2 than Aventurine. Unfortunately, the elation damage formula just doesn't utilize damage percent at all, so even if Aventurine's damage counted as follow-up attacks, it still wouldn't get buffed by Blade's E2 as long as it still counts as elation damage. The way to fix this would be to give Aventurine a way to convert damage bonus into elation bonus. But for me, suggesting this as a change to Aventurine's base kit felt like such a manufactured way to force synergy between Aventurine and Blade. Instead, my approach was to create synergy that felt a lot more natural and creative. However, I don't mind putting this manufactured synergy into Aventurine's Eidolons instead of his base kit. Therefore, my suggestion is to change Aventurine's E1 or E2 to allow his elation skills to count as follow-up attacks, and allow him to convert any damage percent that would affect follow-up attacks into elation percent instead, perhaps at half the value or something to balance it out. That would make for a strong and fun Eidolon that addresses a lot of people's issues. With Aventurine's fervor stacking buffed in his base kit, it would help his current E2 have a lot more value too. As of currently, increasing the max fervor to 50 doesn't do much, since Aventurine usually can't even reach it. So with better fervor stack generation, I'm fine keeping this E2 effect somewhere in his Eidolons. His E4 is also super weird, since it causes him to overcap on defense thread in the AshBlade team, particularly when he's using the Magical Girl relic set. But if he doesn't use the Magical Girl relic set, then the E4 also isn't enough defense thread to bring him to 100%. Personally, I would just scrap this E4 altogether and do something else with it, maybe giving him more team-wide buffs. And lastly, the E6. This won't be relevant to most people, but as somebody who hopes to pull E6 Aventurine, all I need them to do is change the weird, nonsensical requirement of needing to cast 2 ultimates before he can start actually triggering the effect of his E6. Just give it to him right off the bat. No ultimates required. Additionally, increase the Merrymake from 25% to at least 35%, which is the same as Evanesia's E6. It's probably asking for too much to make it 50% Merrymake like Silverwolf, but he should at least match Evanesia's Merrymaking E6, since there's really no good reason for Aventurine's to randomly be a lower number. With these changes, I think Aventurine's base kit would be a lot more coherent and make a lot more sense for the AshBlade duo, while a lot of the issues with his Eidolons would also be addressed. To summarize, my proposed Aventurine changes for the AshBlade team are as follows. Redistribute a lot of Aventurine's damage to being additional damage, which makes a lot of his damage occur whenever his allies launch attacks. Allow Aventurine to give certified banger stacks to EV non-elation characters, giving them defense ignore or some other type of buff based on their certified banger stacks, so that they're actually benefiting from the Aha instant despite not being elation path characters. Increase the punchline stack generation of Aventurine's solo elation teams to buff his damage more and to give consistent enough certified banger for himself and the rest of the team if he is buffing the team based on certified banger stacks. Increase his fervor stack generation so he can better maximize his damage and so he can better utilize his Eidolons, which depend on higher fervor stacks. stacks, buff his speed to elation conversion to at least be equal to Silverwolf 999, since she has the exact same trace as his, but just with double the numbers, for no apparent reason. Put his current E1 in his base kit, allowing him to launch his elation skill for every increment of 10 fervor stacks he reaches, beyond just the initial 10 stacks. And buff his Eidolons all around, potentially letting him convert damage percent to elation percent, and allowing his elation skills to count as follow-up attacks, as well as fixing his clunky E6. With all of these changes, Aventurine would feel much better suited to the AshBlade team, fixing his own clunky damage problems, and also making the playstyle of the whole team much more synergistic. However, will they make any of these changes? Quite a few of these changes would require a pretty big overhaul to how Aventurine's kit works, particularly the change that moves a lot of his power budget into becoming additional damage, as well as the change that allows allies to benefit from Certified Banger despite not being Elation Path, which in my opinion are the most promising and interesting suggestions I made here. So it'll be pretty sad if Hoyo is only interested in buffing the damage numbers of Aventurine's current kit without giving him any extra mechanics to benefit the team more. And if this is the case, where Hoyo only buffs Aventurine's damage and nothing else, then that brings us to the final topic, Hypercarry Aventurine, which mainly just refers to pairing him with characters that don't do much personal damage, like Robin and Tribby. There isn't actually much I want to say here, other than if the only changes to Aventurine are the changes that directly buff his damage, such as giving him more punchline and fervor stacks and increasing his damage multipliers, then it's very likely that Aventurine becomes better outside of the AshBlade team. Not because AshBlade are bad, but because Aventurine's current issue is that he is not bringing enough to the AshBlade duo, to the point where using Aventurine on the team is actively sabotaging AshBlade's damage. So if they don't fix the synergy at all, then there's a good chance you would rather focus the team around fully buffing Aventurine's damage instead of using AshBlade, especially since AshBlade are not going to be doing the type of damage you're used to them doing if Aventurine is on the team, providing little of value. To be clear, this isn't inherently a bad thing. Robin, Summeretto, and Tribby are very powerful characters, and mixing and matching these two with Ashveil or Blade, or just ditching AshBlade altogether, is fully capable of producing good results if Aventurine's kit gets buffed to make that the preferable playstyle. I personally have no issues if this is the direction they take Aventurine, as long as it's strong and finally makes him feel like a modern day DPS. But I do think it'll be much more boring. So essentially, there are 3 directions they could take Aventurine in his upcoming V3 beta update. Either they lean fully into his Elation playstyle, buffing his numbers without buffing any of his stack generation or synergy with follow-up attack units from his solo Elation talent, or they could lean fully into the follow-up attack playstyle, either giving him better synergy with AshBlade, or focusing fully on his own damage within the solo Elation playstyle, and pushing his partnership with Robin Summeretto instead of AshBlade. While I would personally be happy no matter which direction they take, as long as he ends up performing better than he currently is, I definitely think redesigning Aventurine around the AshBlade synergy is the most interesting thing they could do with his kit, and it would be a little disappointing if the only changes they gave him were just bigger numbers. But those are just some of my ideas on how I would fix Aventurine Waveflair. What do you think about the potential within Aventurine's kit, as well as my suggested changes for him? Was there anything you particularly agreed or disagreed with? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on how you would personally buff or redesign any aspect of Aventurine's kit. And be sure to like the video if you find it helpful or enjoyable at all. I will definitely continue to cover everything related to Aventurine's kit, including his V3 buffs coming up soon, as well as how he ends up performing from then until his release. So consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on that. Thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!